can go. For drill, abandon ship, abandon ship, abandon ship. I'm the captain, the master, so I'm the man in charge of all the ship and the people on board. So my function is to check that everything will be done in a smooth way. When I was very young, I do a lot of sailing boats, and one of my uncle was a master, and I always do some sailing boat. And when I become a little bit older, I start to walk, and I don't find my place ashore. I look at sea jobs, and on the sea jobs, it's the only ones who was acceptable for me was a master. It takes a long time to become a captain. It's many years of school and many years of navigation. I was lucky to become captain at 35 since more than 10 years.
Congratulations for the anchoring, it was absolutely perfect. Well done.
It's an expedition. It's not a cruise in the Mediterranean Sea between Barcelona and Roma. I will say that in Antarctica I love the scenery navigation like the Neumayer, the Le Mer Channel, Herrera, Aguirre. This small navigation for a seaman is really incredible. Of course the wildlife, but I will say that the wildlife is most beautiful is in South Georgia. South Georgia is really incredible for that.
Hello, darling, this is you. Darling, it's so nice to have you back where you belong. Darling, never go away. Darling, never go away. Darling, never go away again.
In name of my entire crew, I wish you an excellent gala dinner and an unforgettable adventure. Thank you. Bon appétit.
Stable ship. 6.
My particularity is to organize a team like a same house, like a family, you know. You cannot do something like chef cook if you don't have your team. Our duty is to give the recipe we have, the sensibility. You can have the same recipe, but you are different chef with different feeling. You have one recipe, but the result is not the same. In Antarctica, all the food we have, the fresh food, come from Ushuaia. Donc it's a fresh food come from Argentina. That's why we feel the season, we try to do our best to have a very good quality.
Okay guys, it's all done. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, all around the ship right now we have humpback whales. They're in individuals, but they're also in small groups. We've got groups of 2s, groups of 3s, groups of as many as 7 or 8, and they're everywhere for at least a mile around us. My best estimate for this one is about 100. Well, these are humpback whales, and they're called humpback whales because they have a hump in their back when they dive down. They're baleen whales, which means they've got all these baleen plates hanging down from the top of their mouth. And in this particular species, there's about 250 of them, and they're frayed on the inside so that they go through the water with their mouth open, and then they close their mouth, and inside is the water and also krill. There's a lot of krill out there. All the birds were also eating the krill. Humpback whales are a medium-sized whale, as whales go. Usually the female's a little larger than males. Females up to about 48 feet now. Males 45 or something like that, 40 tons. So it's a big, broad animal. Researchers finally found out that some of the females during the breeding time are staying down way out of sight. Nobody saw them in 30 years of looking at them, and they're staying down for as much as 45 minutes. So they have that capacity to dive very deep and very long. These humpback whales probably lived to well over 100 years. They found harpoons in bowhead whales that hadn't been made or used for 125 years. When a whale was killed, there was a harpoon in one of the old harpoons. Looks like some of the bowheads are 250 years old.
We are maybe, for me, the best place in the world. We are in South Georgia. The species that you see here is the second largest species of penguins in the world after the emperors, and these are the king penguins. You are going to see eggs, you are going to see chicks from the last year, you are going to see even chicks from the last season just molting now and ready to go at sea. And you have at least, let's see, maybe 60,000 breeding pairs here. King penguins are a very particular species of penguins when we talk about the breeding cycle of them. Maybe with other seabirds has the longest breeding cycle, talking about how long it takes for a pair to rear a chicks. They take a year, more than a year, if you also include the molting of the chicks. The adults have, or they can rear 2 chicks every 3 years. Sometimes they can skip the season, sometimes they are ready to start the game, but they are not going to make it, because you have to remember that all the chicks that hatch for the eggs are late February or March, and these are going to be failures breeders. Then when the adults finish with the chicks, they go at sea, they spend most of the time there, and then in autumn and winter, sometimes they can come quite often to the colony to feed the chicks. Some of them are really good parents, some of them, some chicks can spend a lot of time fasting without any food. The king penguins, they have very good diving capabilities, and they are mainly related to their main prey. This main prey is a lanternfish. It's a kind of fish that have movement during the day and during the night on the column of water. And according with this movement of the prey is how deep the king penguins dive.
This is the whalers' cemetery. In fact, it was first of all a sealers' cemetery. It was found when an expedition came here in 1902, and they found some graves of 19th century sealers. And so when the whaling factory was set up, it was the obvious place to bury the mainly Norwegians who staffed the century, those that died. And if you look at the graves, they're all young men. It's rather sad, cut off in their prime. But it was also became the cemetery for Sir Ernest Shackleton. He died aboard his ship Quest out in the harbour there in the middle of Grytviken because they didn't know what to do with the body, whether they should bury it here or it was sent back in a ship. And when they got to Montevideo, they had a message from Shackleton's wife, Lady Shackleton, to say take him back and bury him in the Antarctic, which is where I suppose his heart was, and she realised that. Well, the story of Shackleton, he led his first expedition to try to get the South Pole. They fell short by about 100 miles, as they realised they didn't have enough food to get there and get home safely, so they turned back. Then Scott and Amundsen, or rather I should say Amundsen and Scott, got to the South Pole, so Shackleton decided the next big journey was to cross the Antarctic continent. He was going to start at the Weddell Sea, cross via the South Pole to the Ross Sea. So he came down here in a ship called the Endurance, heading to the head of the Weddell Sea where he was going to set up a base, but the ship was trapped in ice. He never got ashore. He drifted north, the ship got crushed by the ice. The men spent weeks drifting on the ice until they got clear of the ice, got into 3 little boats and had the most horrible journey across to Elephant Island. Some of them would probably have died very shortly if they hadn't got ashore. And of course no one in the world knew where they were, so Shackleton knew he had to go and get help. They took their little boat, the James Care, and they sailed across to South Georgia and amazingly didn't founder in the stormy seas. But they got to the other side of the island. And all the whaling stations are on this side, the north side. So Shackleton had to cross the island, completely unmapped, uncharted mountains and glaciers. He knew roughly which direction, head east, to get to Stromness Bay, where there were 3 whaling stations, and lots of adventures on the way. And I think the main thing was he saw Z-shaped folded strata at the head of the bay, which he knew was Stromness Bay, so he knew he was going in the right direction. And then they famously heard the station whistle, waking the men up in the morning, and then they waited for half an hour, and there was a second whistle which called the men to work, so he knew he was really on track. It still wasn't easy going, and they staggered into the whaling station at Stromness, were taken to see the manager who Shackleton had met, and he met them at the door and said, "Who the hell are you?" Not surprisingly, because they were a bit dirty, dishevelled, and generally horrible. And I think the amazing part of the story is they had a bath, they were given new clothes, and they sat and talked to the manager, listened about the First World War. It had broken out just as they left, and it was still running 2 years later, millions being killed, the station manager said. And how they didn't fall asleep in their chairs in the warm room, I don't know. They were magnificent men.
Grytviken is the first whaling station established in the entire southern hemisphere, so very historic site. South Georgia Heritage Trust has a strong interest in the human heritage on this island. And this station obviously developed through the years from the small station that was built first in 1904 and developed to a huge station that would have been worked by around 450 men. And what we're looking into here is the old factory. All of these structures that you see here used to be inside vast corrugated iron buildings. Sadly, they had to be removed because there were so many contaminants on this site that actually, without that, we wouldn't be able to walk through the site as we just have. This station processed 175,000 whales. There were 7 of these stations on the island. Each one of them had tens of whale catchers, so the effort of whaling on this island was huge. And of course, from the early days when, for the first 2 years that this factory was working, they actually didn't leave Cumberland Bay. There were so many whales out there in Cumberland Bay that they could just pop out, catch a whale and process it. But once this larger effort came in and they had more and more catcher vessels, they had to go further and further out to sea. And so actually, of course, soon these stations started to struggle to make enough money. And the first of them had closed in the mid-1930s. But this station carried on working to the mid-1960s. The church was actually put up quite early on, 1913. The idea behind it was Captain Carl Anton Larsen, who had established this factory. He was a Christian. He wanted to look after his men's well-being. He raised the funds from the community of South Georgia, and this church that we have here was first built in Norway. Then it was flat-packed, brought down here, reconstructed by the whalers, and first consecrated then on Christmas Eve. So over 100 years old now.
Has anchored off of Penguin Island, and we've climbed to the top of this volcano. And this is a very interesting story about what happened here. During the Ice Age, this volcano erupted and created this cinder cone, which we know is a very young cone in Antarctica. And you can see the interior crater where the gases blew out the top of the volcano. One of the interesting things about the volcano in Penguin Island is this giant stack of rocks that we see here, and this represents the neck or the vent of the volcano where the magma was moving up and the lava erupted out of the top of that column. There are reports that some early sealers and whalers saw smoke coming out of the top of Penguin Island, and it's possible that this was active as recently as the 1800s. But geologically, this has probably been a cone for a few thousand years.
Here we are at Half Moon Island in Moon Bay, surrounded by Livingston Island. It's kind of a mysterious gray day, but we do have a chance to see some of the marine mammals here. Passing by, we've got lots of Antarctic fur seals, these young males, just like we saw yesterday, just fighting with each other, learning how to be a territorial male. We have these Weddell seals. There's a beautiful male, a very young female. That's probably just a yearling there. Well, these Weddell seals are just magnificent animals. They're beautiful just in the patterns on their pelt. This one has just molted, so it's got the beautiful gray, light and dark gray patterns on it. They're amazing. They will spend their days just lying around, and you'd think they don't do anything. But especially at nighttime, as the scattering layer comes up towards the surface, they'll be out hunting for fish. And they'll go down as deep as 2,000 feet and trying to get to where the food is. And they'll stay down as much as 45 minutes, even an hour. And these are the ones that breed deep in the fast ice, way down in the southern part of this area. And when in September, October, when it's terribly, terribly cold, and these little tiny pups, well, little tiny, I mean 60 to 80 pounds, but still small animal, and they will immediately freeze because of the amniotic fluids. And then they have this brown fat, and they're able to survive in this area. It's absolutely extraordinary.
we are here in the Antarctic Peninsula. This is our first continental landing, even though we've been in these beautiful places. The species that you can see behind me right now is the species that we were looking at today. It's a gentoo penguin. It's one of the 3 species of brush-tailed penguins that you can see in Antarctica. Today is more as a gentoo day for us. And also in the area you are going to see some of the predators that they have, like the kelp gulls, the skuas. Gentoo penguins are the 3rd largest species of penguins after the emperors and the king. Even though they are completely different genera, and they are pygocelids together with the Adélie and the chinstraps, and they lay 2 eggs like and as you can see in some of the shots here that they have these 2 beautiful chicks now, gray, fluffy and white underneath, and with the most beautiful red beak.
This is Port Charcot, and it's a special place in Antarctic history because this was the first place that the French explorer Jean-Baptiste Charcot overwintered. This was in 1903. Now, Charcot was a rich man, unlike most people who set up expeditions, so he was able to partly fund his own expedition and build an extremely strong ship. He was a very keen yachtsman, so he knew about boats, and the drawback actually was he ran out of money rather before he bought the engine. The engine was let him down several times. It was second-hand, didn't work very well, but he came down, well, by accident actually, and the accident wasn't his. He was intending to head up to the Arctic. He'd always wanted to go up there. Then he heard that the Swedish expedition under Otto Nordenskjöld was missing. It hadn't been heard of for over a year. The ship, the Antarctic, should have come back and it hadn't. So he turned round and headed down to the Antarctic. But he got as far as Buenos Aires and found that Nordenskjöld had been rescued by an Argentine ship. So he continued down to the Antarctic Peninsula. He wanted to explore the western side where we are now, and he sailed up and down the coast, finding new places, surveying them, collecting scientific information, and overwintered here at Port Charcot. Now, it's very bad form to name a place after yourself, but he named it after his father, who was a very famous neurologist, so he got round it that way. And he found a place deep inside Port Charcot where he could anchor the ship, and he put a chain across to keep the ice away from it during the winter so that it wasn't crushed. And he set up little huts ashore for the scientific instruments, and they lived comfortably aboard. And Charcot, he's not well known even in France, but he was an extremely good leader, took great care of his men, and one of the things he did was each man's bunk had a door on it, a sliding door, so the man could hide away from everyone else and have a bit of privacy. And of course, being a French expedition, they had a wine ration, they had fresh bread every day. Charcot actually, that they had a rum ration because Charcot thought that rum was a very good medicine.